Let me apologize, and I hate to have to apologize on the very first video I made, but I've just finished recording the entire Introduction to Psalms lesson, and then found out that the video portion that I put at the beginning did not record in a visual way at all, because I evidently pushed the button wrong. That's part of the problem I have with my poor vision. So I apologize, the audio's there, but I'm just going to have to pop up a slide for you to see until we get about a third or so of the way into the lesson, when you'll be able to see 100% of all the things that I did on the computer as part of this lesson. And that's all there, and all of the things I said are there. But unfortunately, the video portion of my introduction, when I held up these two books, which I'll now do so you can see them. These are the two books that I held up and spoke about in the introduction, and you'll see that, or you're going to hear that coming up. This is the book of Psalms translated by Eugene Peterson in a paraphrased way. And this is the book that I used from the New Living Translation of the book of Psalms, which shows many visual aspects of the book of Psalms, so that you can have more of an artistic approach to reading the words that are there. So now I'm just going to edit into the audio that I did in the introduction, and you'll have to watch the slide while I'm talking, but then we'll cut over to the video of my actual computer screen and all that's there. Thanks for watching. This is an introduction to the book of Psalms, and I've picked Psalms as a book to study and to share with you, because through all of my life it's been the place I have gone to the most in all of Scripture when things have been really, really bad, and also when things have been good, when there have been celebrations and things to be excited about. I've been out of work several times in my career. I've had some physical problems, some sicknesses, and Psalms have been there and helpful and useful to me and encouraging to me. I've had times of celebration, adopting Haley and adopting Dylan, my son Mike's wedding to Lily, some great times, moving into this new house that we're in now, new to us. It's a 60 or 70-year-old house, but we love it, and God has blessed us with a wonderful place that we can live here now with our new 2 young children as we expand our family even more. But I've also been through some pretty tough times. My son died, Aaron, last year, and that was a deeply tough time for me and for our family. And when things like that happen, and you get frustrated and angry with God, angry with the world, angry with society, and all those things, the Psalms are a place you can go and find a kindred spirit, a place that will speak to your heart. And the reason that I want to talk about the book of Psalms is because that's why God gave us this particular book in the Bible. We tend to think often of the Bible as just a single book, but it's not. It was written over a period of almost 2,000 years by many, many different authors and compiled together. And each of those single
books within a book has a purpose, a reason for why it's there. Some of it is history, some of it's biography, some of it is there to teach us about God. Some of the passages are there to teach us how to relate to each other and how society should work and how people should be treated. Jesus went in so many different ways to accomplish that in the New Testament. And as Christians, we tend to focus a lot on the New Testament and often leave the Old Testament almost as an unimportant prior set of information that we don't really need to worry about it. And Psalms is not like that. Psalms is there to relate to us, to speak to our hearts in times of joy and in times of sorrow and in times of frustration and even those times when we are angry with God, because the authors of the Psalms had times when they were angry at God, and they let us know that that's okay. And I'm encouraged when I can see all these different aspects of life reflected there, and understand that there are others who see as I see things and feel the things that I feel, and love God the way that I still love God through and in spite of all those things. So in brief, when we look at the Bible as a whole, it's made up of, as I mentioned, different types of elements, history and biography and doctrine and teaching and relational things. And it's important as we study and read through the Bible that we realize which parts we're reading were written for what purpose, or to put it in a more literary way, what the genre is of some of the different books of the Bible. It's very obvious when you read the books of the Gospels, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that they're basically a biography of Jesus, what he did and what he said. The book of Acts is a history of the beginning of the church and also has some biography about Peter and Paul in it and some of the other disciples and apostles. Then we've got Paul's writings, which primarily are addressed to churches and are for the purpose of teaching and helping the churches to grow and to be what God wants and needs them to be and what they can be. And we go back in the Old Testament and we see history all through some of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, and then Joshua and Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Those are all books of history with some biography entailed, because history is, after all, the story of people. And we get to look at people's lives through all that. But then we've got prophets that wrote many of the latter books of the Old Testament for the purposes of proclaiming judgment in many cases, and also rebuking and teaching the people of God in Israel and the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes. And we have some books that are tucked away in the middle that are a little different. They're often called books of wisdom or wisdom literature. And Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. It's different. It's important that we treat these different sections and parts of the Bible as what they were and what they are. You do not read a book of a prophet of proclamation and rebuke the same way that you read a book that's teaching us about how churches can solve some of the issues and problems in leadership. Of course, some of those things will occasionally have applications that overlap, but their purposes are different. Their audience is different. A history is something that is there for us to see how God worked with people. And now we get to the Psalms. Right smack dab in the middle of the Bible, we have 150 Psalms that we've been blessed to have, written by many different people. David wrote a significant number of the Psalms, and there are others who were authors of the Psalms. Some are listed and given to us, and some are anonymous, but they have been collected and considered to be part of Holy Scripture for thousands of years now. And their value is, without any doubt at all, necessary and important to anyone who loves God and wants to see what God has for us and wants to know how we can relate to God and when it impacts our feelings and our emotions, with joy and with sorrow, with anger and with thanksgiving. Now, I treat the Psalms, because of its nature and its genre, differently than many of the other parts of the Bible. And I think it's important that you understand why that is so. The book of Psalms is poetry, and poetry is not prose. Its purpose and its way of expression is entirely different. And most of what I want to do today as we look at the book of Psalms in an introductory fashion is to consider and think about and discuss how and why poetry is different than prose and what that means when we sit down to read or listen to the Psalms. The first thing that's important to know is that every single one of the Psalms was originally written as a song. They were sung by the people in the nation of Israel. They were a song, every one of those 150. And we don't have the music anymore. That's been lost to the ages. But we have the poetry, the lyrics, if you will. And you know, just as I do, that poetry and lyrics have different ways of expressing things. There's poetic tools that are used, metaphor, simile, alliteration, repetition, contrasting versus comparing. These are all pieces and parts of poetry that are different than when things are written in prose. The other thing, and I'm sure that some of you will consider this controversial, but it's really not. When you read poetry, you have to understand that poetry is not written to be literal in a word-for-word sense. Now, that doesn't mean that the words don't have meaning. They do. And it doesn't mean that we don't have to understand what the words are. We obviously need to understand the words and what they mean. But the purpose of poetry is to speak to your heart. And the purpose of prose is to speak to your mind. And those two things are done differently. As we go through and look at some of the Psalms, you will see that they are obviously not written to be literal. When it tells us things that God did and said, they are being portrayed in a poetic way, which does not mean they aren't inspired, they aren't from God, they aren't useful and proper, but they are poetry. And they are there to speak to our hearts, not just to our minds. Which doesn't mean we turn our minds off when we look at the book of Psalms. Now, because they are poetry, and because we are learning and studying in this way, there are two books that I recommend that have been really helpful to me. I've had this one for many years, maybe 30 years now. This is the Psalms as translated in a paraphrase by Eugene Peterson. This is a standalone book, but these same Psalms by this same translator, Eugene Peterson, are in fact the same as you would find if you read the Psalms in the Bible he translated, the Message. Now you have to understand that the Message is a paraphrase. It's not a literal word-for-word translation, and that's on purpose. Eugene Peterson sought to make the emotions that are portrayed in the Hebrew of the book of Psalms transformable into a way that would impact us in our society the same way as it impacted them more than 2,000 years ago when the book of Psalms was written and compiled. The other version that I have of the Psalms that I have found really, really useful is the Psalms in the New Living Translation. In particular, this book is really helpful because it also utilizes visual ways to express the Psalms and the words that are contained there that help to make it maybe even a little bit artistic in the way that the words are expressed. So as I've read through the Psalms, and I have read Psalms many, many, many more times than I can count. It's been by my bed and in my heart and on my iPad and my computer and in my books for many, many years. And the truth that is in the Psalms comes through in all these different manners because of the nature of its being poetry. So I recommend reading the Psalms in a paraphrase because Eugene Peterson has managed to pull out the deep passion and emotion of the Psalms into a current idiom that speaks to our hearts the way it spoke to the hearts of the ancient Israelites. The New Living Translation does a similar kind of thing. It's less literal. Unless you think I'm just a crazy liberal guy who doesn't believe in the inspiration of the Bible, my normal study Bible is the ESV and sometimes the NASB. I prefer a good, solid, literal translation of the Bible when I'm studying. But for the Psalms, it's different, because the Psalms aren't where I'm going to learn primarily doctrine and teaching and those kind of things. I'm in the Psalms to have it speak to my heart and to be encouraged and to find solace and comfort and empathy from those who are experiencing the same things I am. And I think that's why it's the way it is, written in poetry and given to us, I believe, as a gift from God. I'm going to move over to my computer now, and the rest of what we see, you'll be looking at my computer screen as I speak, so that you can look at some of the tools and the things that I've extracted in order to make the points of what we're doing in this introduction. Okay, I'm at my computer now, and let's look at some of the quotations and excerpts that I've pulled together that talk about the Psalms. Martin Luther, uh, like many of the great theologians over the ages, spent a lot of time in the Psalms, and this is something that he wrote in his preface to his commentary on the Psalms. He says the human heart is like a ship on a stormy sea, driven about by winds blowing from all four corners of heaven. The book of Psalms is full of heartfelt utterances made during storms of this kind. Where can one find nobler words to express joy than in the Psalms of praise or gratitude? In them you can see into the hearts of saints as if you were looking at a lonely pleasure garden or were gazing into heaven. How fair and charming and delightful the flowers that you will find there. Athanasius, one of the early church fathers, had several things to say about the Psalms. The Psalms have a unique place in the Bible because most of the Scripture speaks to us, while the Psalms speak for us. Athanasius also said, I believe that a man can find nothing more glorious than these Psalms, for they embrace the whole life of man, the affections of his mind, and the motions of his soul. To praise and glorify God, he can select a psalm suited to every occasion, and thus will find that they were written for him. Indeed. The next several slides I have are excerpts from a book that I have called Psalms Old and New, Exegesis, Intertextuality, and Hermeneutics. Now those are theological terms. Exegesis means pulling out from the text what it meant when it was originally written. Intertextuality is comparing different parts of one book with another book, or one part of the text with another part of the text. Hermeneutics is tools that we use to figure out how to understand what the Bible's saying. So this is a very practical book on how to get meaning from the book of Psalms. And here it says, the Psalter and Isaiah share in common the fact that they are poetry, exalted, sacred poetry. And as poetry, their language partakes of all the characteristics of poetry: rhythm, rhyme, assonance, alliteration, and the creative use of metaphor, images, and the like. The language of analogy is to the fore, again and again and again, and not just any kinds of analogies, but analogies particularly in the Psalms that draw on some of the most common human experiences: trials, tribulations, suffering, rescue, as experiences in both the present and the future. So you see, the Psalms is not just about looking back into an ancient book, but rather drawing from it things that we need and can use today. From that same book, it says, in fact, the Psalter is rather unique in the Old Testament in its being a revelation of the human heart poured out to God in sung prayer. The Psalter is not just any kind of songbook. It is a sacred songbook of praise, thanksgiving, lament, celebration, and pilgrimage in which God is addressed again and again. Furthermore, the Psalms are indeed songs, and as songs they speak to and from the affective side of human nature, showing forth the whole gamut of human emotions. Music reaches and speaks for the parts of human nature that are not merely cognitive. Studying the lyrics to songs as if they were literal theological treatises is a mistake, and many commentaries and commentators on the Psalms over the ages have fallen into this trap. This is not because there are no profound thoughts to be found in the Psalms. It is because too often we ignore the very genre or character of the Psalms, which are so full of dramatic hyperbole. Nothing is more discouraging and deadening than watching someone attempt a literal reading of figurative language. But that, of course, was not the intent of the psalmist in the first place. And fortunately, the earliest Christians knew this. They did not ponder how exactly the hills might skip like rams when theophany happens, or whether literally God's nose burned, as the Hebrew suggests, when he waxed wroth. The Psalms were read and spoken and sung, and must be approached with full sensitivity to the kind of literature they are, lyric poetry. So let us see if we can still hear the music, though we don't know the tunes anymore. Let us see if we can still be caught up in love and wonder and praise, as were the original psalmists, and find out why these very texts transfixed and transfigured the earliest Christians. A detailed study of the Psalms can help us not only by correcting for our blind spots, but by reminding us that life, including devout Christian life, involves both tragedy and triumph. And the Psalms again and again tell us that we must go through, not around, the darkness in order to reach the dawn. Let me read that again. The Psalms again and again tell us that we must go through, not around, the darkness in order to reach the dawn. In the end, even Psalm 23, so beloved by Christians, would not be able to help us much had the psalmist never walked through the valley of deep darkness before he dwelt in the house of the Lord forever. Now, I want to use a common everyday poem that we all are familiar with, and one of my very favorites, just as an example as we conclude this introduction to the book of Psalms, to try and clarify the difference between looking at a poem literally versus as poetry, figuratively, symbolically, using all of the tools of poetry. I'm going to read through this poem that you all know, and then I want to go back and look at it just a little bit and show you the difference. The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other, as just, as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for the passing there had worn them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day. Yet, knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Now, as we look at this poem that speaks so clearly, let me ask you, is this a poem about woods, about trees, about a path in the woods? No, of course it isn't. If you look at the words of this poem, and you're trying to find out in the first line a yellow wood, well, let's see, let's look at the meanings of yellow wood. What kind of tree could that have been that would have made a woods look yellow? And trying to analyze that to get to the true depth of meaning in yellow wood, you would miss the point of what the poem is talking about. If you are looking at the difference between the paths and how one was traveled versus the other, and tried to analyze what did he mean by grassy? What kind of grass was it? See, this is the way we study the Bible often. And in many, many places in the Bible, that is the best way to study. You have to find out what theological words mean. You have to understand the purpose and what's trying to be expressed there, and the deepness of the word studying. Theologians often use the term word study, which is digging down deep to find out what a particular word means in this instance when it's used. But with poetry, if you're digging down deep and looking at each individual word to find its true meaning, what you miss is the whole purpose of the psalm or the poem. This poem is written to teach us to look back at our lives and decisions that we have made and how those decisions have impacted who and what we have become. It's about choices. It's not about the woods. It's not about the path. It's not about what kind of trees or grasses are there. It's not about the minutiae of the words. It's about the impact of the message of the poem. And that is how I and many people, many theologians, many Old Testament scholars, approach the book of Psalms, and I think it is the right way, which is not to say that as we look at the book of Psalms, I'm going to ignore the theology that's there. We're going to learn things about God and how he looks at things in the book of Psalms. But we are not going to get buried into the theology and miss the passion and emotion of the thanksgiving and lament and joy and praise that's there. Because that's what the message of the Psalms has been given to us for. This is my first lesson on the book of Psalms. It's an introduction. I will not be covering every single psalm because, honestly, to cover every psalm in the book of Psalms would take me years and years. But we are going to look at many of the psalms, and we're going to look at the different kinds of psalms, the purposes that they are there for, and draw from them things that are useful and helpful. Useful and helpful. We'll look at Psalm 1 next. It'll be the place we start, and we will hit a good number of the psalms that are there in the first 20 or 25 psalms, and then we may skip around a little bit more after that. So, you know what they say: like, share, subscribe. That's the YouTube thing. But I tell you what I'd like you to do. If you think this is helpful, and you think this is going to be something of value to you, why not share it with your friends? You can post a link to this YouTube video on Facebook or in Instagram or any of the other ways that you share things that you find valuable and useful in your life with your friends. Because while I enjoy teaching, and I would teach if there were nobody listening, I also think that it's even better when I can teach some things and others get to hear what wisdom and passion and emotion comes from the Bible that can impact us and make a difference every day. Can make a difference when we're frustrated and angry. Can help us celebrate with joy when we are at a place where we have been blessed and we see God's work in our lives and in our families and in our churches. So do that for me, please. Share this with your friends. And I look forward to soon, in just several weeks, having our teaching and our lesson on Psalm number 1 coming up and ready for you to be able to share it with your friends. Thank you.